more relevant to those who would call this church their church family. But that being said, you are very welcome. And to be honest, what a brilliant Sunday for you to be with us, to see what all of this is about. So we are so glad you're with us. But before we get into all of that, I do just want to take a few more moments to explain more what we mean by Vision Sunday. But because it could be that you read those words on the screen and you think, oh, here's time for the church to release their new vision, new term, new vision. What's the new vision statement going to be? But if that's your expectation, I'm going to have to disappoint you, because that's not the case this morning. We're not releasing some brand new vision today. In fact, you may or may not know that we as a church have a vision statement. And I'll just read it from the screen that I can see. It's this. Our vision is to be a 21st century New Testament church that responds to and shares the love of God. That is our simple vision statement. We've had it for many years before I was an elder, and we still feel that this encapsulates our call as a church. It encapsulates who we want to be. We want to be a church that's faithful to the Bible, the New Testament in particular, but also faithful to our 21st century culture that we're called to reach. And what are we called to do? Well, we believe that Jesus has called us first to respond to God and his love and have a relationship with him, but as a result of that, to share his love. And this is our vision statement, and it's not going to change this morning. That is going to stay the same. But why do we have this Sunday? Well, it's because though the vision doesn't change, it is important to know that our application of the vision will change in every new season. Though the vision never changes, we will, every new season, have to think, how does that same vision look in this new circumstance? Maybe an illustration of kind of that dynamic would be if you were to imagine yourself as Serena Wiegmann, the wonderful manager of our brilliant Lionesses. If you're watching the Women's World Cup over the summer, I'm sure we've all imagined ourselves to be Serena Wiegmann at some point. And if you did, I'm sure she went to the World Cup with one vision in mind: to win the trophy. And that vision, I'm sure, didn't change from the days they started training into the group stages, the finals, and then the final itself. That vision would have stayed exactly the same. But the way she applied that vision and managed the team would have had to look different at every single stage. When they were playing different teams with different tactics, they'd have to train slightly differently. When Kira Walsh got injured or Lauren James got that red card, she would have had to kind of change the formation, bring in different players. And you say, Serena, what's going on? Why are you changing all the time? Well, of course, you wouldn't ask that question, because the vision is staying the same, and she's making the changes to stay true to that same vision. And it's the same for us as a church. Our vision has not changed and will not change. We are still a church that wants to love God and love people. But in this new season, it's important for us to think, how does that look now? What particular ways is God calling us to follow that vision now? And that's what this morning is going to be about. And in particular, we as elders want to share what we believe are two particular calls that we need to pay attention to in this coming season. And these calls are both very simple, and they both come from a passage in Mark 12, which was the inspiration for the second part of our vision statement. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to read that short passage from Jesus, and then I'm going to pray, and then we're going to consider what these two calls are and what they mean for us as a church. So why don't I read the passage from Mark 12, verse 28, and here it is on the screen. It says this. It says, one of the scribes approached Jesus, and when he heard them debating and saw that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, which command, that is the commands in the Torah, the 613 in the Bible, he says, which command is the most important of all? And Jesus answered, the most important is, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other command greater than these. Let me just pray. Jesus, we just again draw our hearts close to you this morning. We believe that you are our ultimate pastor, our chief shepherd, the Bible calls you. And we thank you also that you're a good shepherd, and that you say of yourself that my sheep know me and will hear my voice. And so we just want to take hold of that promise this morning and ask Jesus, as we spend time in your word, would we hear your voice leading us? Would we see you as our shepherd leading us into the new term? And would you give us courageous hearts to follow you where you want to call us? We pray this in your name. Amen. Okay, so just taking this passage as our kind of ground level, I believe there are two calls in there for us to pay attention, particularly in this next term. And the first, again, very simple, is this, that we're called to love our neighbours. That's the first call for us this term, love our neighbours. So I guess the first thing you would observe from that passage, if you were reading it, is the somewhat strange way that Jesus responds to this scribe's question, because the scribe asks him, what is the most important command in the Bible? And Jesus responds with not one, but two. And the reason this is strange is not so much because Jesus gives, the questioner more than he bargains for. Because if you read through the Gospels, Jesus always loves surprising people and giving them more than they ask for. But what I find particularly interesting about this passage is that Jesus does know the correct answer to the question. He has in his mind what the most important command is. He says that of the first one, doesn't he? If you look closely, he says the most important is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the other one he describes, he says it is the second. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. So the reason Jesus is giving two commands here, love God and love people, is not because he kind of can't make up his mind between them. It's not like he's got them both and thinking, they're both really good, can't make up my mind, just take both, do both and you'll be fine. Jesus is very clear of the order. And yet he still kind of can't help himself adding on the second. And it's almost like Jesus, when he utters the call to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, Jesus can't even conceive of doing that without thinking of how it looks for other people in your life. Jesus can't imagine a way that you could love God with your whole self without thinking of how that looks in loving those around you. And in fact, drawing from other passages in the Bible, I think we could say that Jesus would say it's impossible to love God without loving people. And the people that Jesus is specifically talking about loving are not just any random people, but they are what he calls neighbours, or what the command calls our neighbour. And you say, who is my neighbour? Well, if you ask that question, luckily someone else in the Bible asked that question to Jesus as well, and he gives a really helpful story to describe it. It's the story of the Good Samaritan, maybe one of Jesus' top 5 most famous. And if you don't know it, it goes like this. There is an Israelite who's making a journey on a highway, but he gets attacked and left for dead. He's bleeding out on this main road. And in the story, 2 other Israelites, first a priest, then a Levite, walk past this man, but they don't do anything to help him because of what it would cost them. But then, in the story, a third man, not an Israelite, but a Samaritan, so not part of this guy's people group, not part of the same family, he walks past, and he looks after the man. That's why it's called the Good Samaritan. He kind of looks after him, he pays for his medical care, he puts him in an inn, comes and checks on him. And the upshot of the story is, who is my neighbour? Well, it's anyone you encounter who is in need. It's not just limited to your family, those in your tribe. It's any human being you encounter who is in need. And Jesus says this is the command that must flow out of loving God. It's loving those in need around you. And just pausing here, I know that all I'm saying so far this morning is not news to many of us. Maybe you're sitting here on a hot Sunday morning thinking, Simon, I've heard this since I was a child. This is like kind of basic Christianity, Simon. Love God and love people. Well, let me just say, the reason I'm saying this is not because I think we don't know it, but because I think this is a particular call for us to pay attention to closely in this next season. And here's why. Now, I think it would be fair to say that since COVID, our priority as a church has been on that first command, on loving God. Now, our priority since 2021, when we were able to meet together, was to spend time worshipping God together, being his people, coming under his word, all as one. And so our priority was reconnecting with God and reconnecting with each other. And of course, that's not to say that we didn't, reach out in that time. We did. And it's also not to say that that priority was wrong. Because, of course, Jesus says that loving God is the most important command. And before we even think about loving others, we must, of course, have loving relationships between ourselves. And that's still a priority. In fact, Andy and Lizzie, who lead our welcome team, at the end of this meeting are going to share a notice about how we're going to continue doing this as a church. But all that said, if we as a church are going to continue outworking our love of God well, there does need to come a time when we very deliberately turn our faces outwards and think about how we love those in need beyond this room. And after kind of hearing words that have come in our Sunday meetings, and through conversations with many of you and through conversations we've had at our elders' meetings, we get the sense that many of us in this room feel that time is now. That the time to start deliberately looking outward and making plans for that is now, in this season. And in particular, there are 3 groups of people that in various ways God has led us to meeting the needs of. And I just want to run through these 3 before I finish this point. The first group of people that God has particularly led our hearts to as a church is those in need in our community. So if you've been part of the church for a year or so, you'll remember that just under a year ago, a group of people in the church started meeting because they all shared a burden for reaching those in need in our community. So they met together, they prayed, they sought God, and they made plans. And the main outflow of that was our community lunches. That's why they started. People had a burden and they met together and it just came out of that. And those have borne fruit as a church. We've run them in the Easter holidays, in the May half term, and also over the summer. And just to share a story, last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, one of these community lunches was running on Wednesday, and a man came in who had just moved into the area because he was homeless and had just been given a home very close to the Life Centre. And he came and got a free lunch and was welcomed, but in conversation it turned out that this man didn't have anything to sleep on. The council had given him a mattress, but it was very hard, and when we saw it, it was very dirty. And so he just kind of said, has anyone in the church got a mattress? And I tell you, it was amazing to watch. Like within a couple of hours, the team kind of mobilized, did a call around some people in the church, found a mattress, organized transport, got it into his house. And so what happened was this guy turned up at 12 for lunch. And by the time he was leaving at 2, he had somewhere to sleep that night, which is just a wonderful way of our body working together to meet needs in our community. Those lunches have borne fruit. But those community lunches were actually always intended as like a first step for that ministry. And they were actually a bit like kind of putting out feelers to feel what are the key needs in the community so that going forward, we as a church could do very deliberate initiatives to meet what we see as the needs that need targeting. And so as a result of those lunches, the community team met this week, and I've heard about some very exciting ideas that are brewing about how we can have like regular events that can reach those in need. And so I want to say, if you are someone in our church who has a particular burden for the sorts of things I've just shared about, I'd love to invite you at the end or through the Life News to contact our community team. And one easy way you can do that is by speaking to Becca, who shared earlier. She'll be at the back. She would love to tell you about some of the plans that the team have been developing. And that will be one way to kind of love our neighbours as a church family over the next term. But as I said, there are two other groups that we feel led to reach as a church. The second is those in our community who might not have physical, social needs, but do have spiritual needs, i.e., everyone around us who doesn't yet know Jesus and who hasn't responded to the gospel. And see, we as a church, as we've said many times, over the past few years have been growing wonderfully. It's wonderful to see many new faces even today. It's wonderful to see many people in the room. God has been blessing us with numbers. But probably most of our growth as a church has come through what's called transfer growth, where people might move from one church to another for all hosts of reasons. And that's wonderful. We love kind of Christians coming and joining us. It's so wonderful to make connections as a church together. But of course, as a church, we're called Ascot Life Church. And that means we exist to see new life in our community, most ultimately through people coming to know Jesus, responding to his love, being baptized, joining his church, and living the life that he calls them to live. And so, as a church, we do, over the next season, have a heart for us to start seeing new life, to start making reaches into our community, to bring people to know Jesus. And of course, like the ultimate way that this boils down to is each of us, kind of as we've heard in the kind of stories that we've been able to share this morning, like reaching out to those around us and kind of catching that burden. But I guess when I've looked at churches where it has really become part of their DNA to like reach people who don't know Jesus, where that's really become part of their culture, what I notice is that they often kind of have a core group of people who really own that burden themselves, and who can kind of own it on behalf of the church, and who can serve the church by first equipping the church to go out and reach their neighbours, friends, families, colleagues, that sort of thing, but who can also, as a group, develop initiatives or coordinate initiatives that can be like corporate mission for us, where we might run things like an Alpha course or a family fun day, or think about how we run our carol concerts, Easter services, that sort of thing. And we feel that kind of bringing together a group like this would be an important step for us as a church to really consider how we can share Jesus' love more widely. And so if you are someone who's sitting and kind of your heart beats when you hear that sort of thing, I would love to invite you to come and speak to me or one of the elders at the end, or just again follow links in the Life News. We would love to just draw some people together to really think and pray, how can we serve our community by sharing the gospel well? And then there's just one third group who Jesus has led us to meet the needs of. And we've shared about this before. It is the Brook Church in Bagshot. So because we've talked about this before, I'm not going to share the whole story. But essentially, the Brook Church Bagshot are another church in our commission family. And they're about 15 or 20 people. And some years ago, they reached out to us as a church for help. And initially, this help was in mainly just filling rotas, so sending over worship leaders and preachers every now and then. But more recently, they've asked us to partner with them to help revitalize them as a church and almost replant them into a flourishing, self-sustaining local church in that area. And what that has materialized into is that in January, that the Brook Church Bagshot sent us all a letter asking us, and asking particularly our eldership team, to oversee them for the next 3 years when their pastor steps down. And their pastor, Chris Connery, is probably just an hour ago preached his final sermon. And so that means that as of tomorrow, we as a church are also going to be partnered with Bagshot and responsible for overseeing them and responsible for helping them establish themselves as a flourishing local church that can sustain themselves into the future. When we kind of heard that call in January, we had all sorts of other things going on. Dave was kind of getting ready to make his exit, and we were thinking, is this really right for us to take this on now? But as we prayed about it and as we sought counsel, we just felt we can't ignore our brothers and sisters in need. And so that means over the next 3 years, a key part of our mission as a church is going to be helping Bagshot flourish and helping them, God willing, by the end of those 3 years, be a flourishing, established local church. And so I want to call all of us, if you would say that you are part of the ALC family, and if you would say that the ALC mission is your mission, could I call you to own Bagshot as part of your mission as well? Could I call you to own the flourishing and establishment of Brook Church in Bagshot? Could I call you to add that to kind of your part of being in Ascot Life Church's mission? And in particular, over the term, there are 3 things that we really would love you to consider in how you can be part of this. And I'll just run through these quickly. The first, we'd love you to consider visiting, or for many of you, visiting Brook Church again over this term. As I said, the Brook Church is about 15 or 20 people. And so that means when 10 people from Ascot Life Church, 5% of us, when 10 people go over, it makes a huge amount of difference. And I know many of you have done that over this term. We're so grateful. We'd love to ask you to consider doing that again, maybe once or twice over this term. And just to kind of make that a little bit easier, because we're now partnering closely with Brook Church, that means that our teaching series, so our series coming up in 1 Corinthians, is now aligned with theirs. So, it makes it even better. If you leave Ascot on a Sunday morning and go to Brook Church Bagshot, you'll see some of the same worship leaders, some of the same preachers, and you'll also receive the same teaching. So we're kind of aligning as a church, as churches in those ways. And we'd love you to consider maybe giving 1 or 2 Sundays a term to going visiting them and kind of giving them some momentum. The other thing, kind of a second step up, would be, could you consider serving at Brook Church Bagshot? The kind of main reason the church started contacting us was because they needed help with rotas, and that is actually still the case. Particularly, their need at the moment is in serving their kids and youth. I know that you kind of look at our kids and youth over in those rooms, see all 20 of our youth go out and you see wildlife. It's kind of this wonderful group of 30 of them. In Brook Church, it's not quite the same. It's like 1 or 2, 3 or 4 youth each time. And so if you don't feel you're able to serve at kids at Ascot, it might be that you are able to serve at Bagshot in a kind of smaller setting. And so I would love you to consider, if you're not serving on a team currently, would you consider maybe serving at Ascot, once a term? That would make a huge difference to them and their rotas as they seek to get established. But the third thing, and I guess really the big thing, or the biggest ask, is we would love as elders to ask you to consider over this term whether God might be calling you to go to Brook Church Bagshot. I guess as we've kind of worked with the leadership at Brook Church, it's become apparent that at some point over the 3 years we're overseeing them, that it will be helpful to send a team to kind of replant the church, almost like as a church plant with foundations. And so one of our goals that we kind of bringing before God is that he would show us some leaders and a group who would be able to go from Ascot 10 minutes down the road to Bagshot and kind of be part of their church, to be part of a replanting team there. And we know that's a big ask to kind of move permanently from Ascot to Bagshot. It might even involve, for some of us, a house move. But we believe this is probably going to be part of what God calls us to do there. And so we would just love you this Sunday onwards. Just consider, might God be calling me to an adventure over there? And it might be that you feel, I can't do that permanently, but I could give 2 years of my next Sundays to just helping Brook Church flourish. That would be so helpful as well. But because we realise that's a big ask, we're just going to make it this Sunday. And then kind of from January onwards in the new year, we're going to seek to see if we can kind of gather a group that might be forming to go and do that. But just on these 3 things, visiting, serving and going, if you feel that any of those are things that you could be a part of, I'd love to invite you to speak to Tom, who will be kind of coordinating our efforts. And just the same with the other 2, we'll be kind of putting links in the Life News that you can follow on that as well, if you'd like to kind of respond to that online as well. But I know that was a lot. But these are 3 ways that we feel, very simply, God is calling us to love our neighbours this year. Jesus says the second command in the Bible that we're to follow is to share the love of God with neighbours who are in need. And these are just 3 groups that God has highlighted the needs of for us. And so we feel over the next term that we want to give some real impetus to serving them as we respond to God's call to us. But it might be that at this point in the message, you're thinking, Simon, that's a lot. How are we going to do that? How are we, as Ascot Life Church, going to serve these 3 groups of needs? How are we going to love our neighbours in this way? That will require so much. And if you ask that question, just rest assured that you're not alone. We have found ourselves asking the same question many times. But as I kind of revisited this passage, I do feel that there is an answer to that question in what Jesus says. And this relates to our second call. See, in that passage, as we have it up on the screen, Jesus, we saw, gives 2 answers to the question. What's the most important command? Well, first, love God. Second, love people. And what we've just been talking about in the last 20 minutes or so is that the outflow of loving God is loving our neighbours. If we really love God, it means that we will also let that love flow out into other images of God who have need around us. But here's the thing, if the second command, loving our neighbour, is the outflow of loving God, then by the same token, loving God and putting him first and being close to him is therefore the fuel for loving neighbours. Does that make sense? So in the same way that loving our neighbours is the outflow of loving God, it means that actually the way we love our neighbours, the way we will be enabled to love more neighbours in the season ahead is through drawing closer to God and receiving more of his love that he wants to share with those around us. And so this is why our second call, again, is a very simple one. It's first to love our neighbours, but secondly, to consider how over this term we can love God first, where we can continue to put him as the first one in our lives as individuals and as a church. Or in the way Jesus puts it in this passage, he says, the most important command is firstly to acknowledge that God is one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. That means not that God is kind of a unitary being, and we believe that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but it means that God is kind of one in his class. We could say he's the one and only, that he's unique. There's no one like him. Loving God first means acknowledging that he is the only one that deserves our praise. And therefore, the command that follows is, so love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, love him from the inside, your emotions, your deepest desires, your deepest thoughts, right to the outside, your strength, your physical strength, and all your resources. Jesus says this, even more than loving neighbours, this is the most important command for us to follow. And of course here he's speaking to individuals, isn't he? He's speaking to an individual scribe. But this call to love God before anything, it is also a call to whole churches as we look through the Bible as well. So as I've been kind of pondering what God's calling us to this year, I've been reminded of the church in Revelation chapter 2. If you know the book of Revelation, at the beginning, Jesus writes 7 letters to 7 churches. The first is a letter to a church in Ephesus. And Jesus says to them a few things. He says, firstly, I see all your good works. He says, I see the way you're serving those around you, serving the poor. I see the way you're loving your neighbours. And secondly, he says, I see your endurance, how you're doing that even through persecution, even though it's costly. But then lastly, he says something which I imagine would have shocked them. He says, but I have one thing against you, that you have lost the love you had at first. He says, you're doing so well at loving your neighbours, you are serving them with good works that can't be counted, but you've lost your love for me. You've lost the love that was the fuel for it. And what that shows me is that it's very possible as a church to become so involved with the outflow of loving God, become so involved with loving neighbours and strategies and plans and initiatives. How can we do this? How can we serve this? That we actually forget what it's all about. That we forget the fuel which is drawing close to God and his love. And here's the thing, if the fuel runs out, it means eventually the car won't function anymore. All that the church does will eventually break down. And so that's why I think the second and most important call we need to pay attention to this year, as we do seek to do more, as Jesus is calling us to, we need to think very carefully about how we put God first, about how we keep him as our number one focus into this term. And you say, how do we do that? Well, of course, the main way we do that is through doing this, through gathering together on Sundays, because that's when we come to hear God's voice through his word and through each other, and it's also when we come to spend time with him. And it's just so wonderful, isn't it? Being in his presence, breaking bread together, enjoying his spirit as he ministers to us. And another way we do it is through life groups, as we meet together, pray, do life together. But there's just one other area of church life that we feel we could make a few changes to really help us follow this call to love God first. And that area is our prayer life as a church. So, as a church, we do currently pray. We pray once a month on Sunday evenings with prayer and praise from 6 till 7 p.m. And we also pray every morning on Zoom from 8:30 till 8:50 from Monday to Friday. And I'd just love to, again, commend all those who so faithfully attend that Zoom prayer meeting, because I think we would all say they're kind of sustaining us as a church. Some of them, they go to that meeting every single day, 20 or so a group. And it's just so encouraging knowing there is a group praying for us each day as a church. But whilst we have a number of prayer meetings already, we do know that these are not accessible to many of us for a number of reasons. And so over the next term, we just want to make a couple additions to our prayer life, which we, though they're small, we hope will have a big impact for us as a church. And I'll just run through these quickly before we finish. The first is that we are going to split out our prayer and praise meeting on a Sunday. We're going to split that out from one Sunday to 2 Sundays. So instead of having prayer and praise one Sunday a month, we're now going to have 2 Sundays a month, one which is a prayer meeting and one which is a worship meeting. So we're kind of taking both elements and splitting them out to 2 Sundays. And we're making a few changes to these meetings in the hope that we can make them even more accessible to even more people in the church. So just to talk about the prayer meeting quickly, it's going to be from 7 till 8 p.m. at the Life Centre. Be starting next week, this. And the structure will be the same every week. So you always know what you're coming to. We're going to have 1 hour, so we're going to spend the first 5-10 minutes or so singing. We'll then work through 4 prayer points over the next 40 minutes. which if you're quick on math, that's 10 minutes on each prayer point. And then we'll finish with a song as well. And for each of those prayer points, we'll pray through each of them a little bit differently. So sometimes we'll pray all together, sometimes we'll pray in groups, sometimes we'll pray all together out loud, sometimes we might pray on our own. And our hope with this is that it means that whatever confidence level you are in prayer, whether you're very happy praying out loud or whether you've never done it before, that these meetings would be accessible to all of us to come and be part of the prayer life of the church. And so that's our prayer meeting, 7 till 8, once a month on Sundays, beginning next week. And then 2 weeks after that, every month, we'll have our worship evening. And this will be slightly longer, 7 till 8:30. And this is where we'll take the kind of praise slot of prayer and praise and enlarge it from, 15 minutes or so to an hour and a half. Because whilst it's wonderful having worship at the beginning of a prayer meeting, we did often feel that you just kind of want to stay there, and you kind of just want to enjoy God's presence. So this is a Sunday just to give us space to do that, space just to linger and hear from God, practice spiritual gifts, just see what He wants to do through us. And our hope, as I say, with both of those meetings is that moving them little bit later and also kind of having a clear structure and invitation to them, that many of us will, be able to attend. And I'd love to invite you, if you've come to prayer meetings before and found they didn't work, I'd love to invite you. Would you reconsider? Because prayer it's a way we connect to God as a church, and it's a way we see Him move. Prayer is kind of the lifeblood of us as a church. And so I'd love for you to consider, could you make this work in your diary and with your kind of schedule and all of that? But it may be that you're hearing this and you're saying, Simon, I'd love to be there, but for all kinds of reasons, I just can't. It takes all I can just to be here on a Sunday morning because of work commitments, family commitments. I just can't make that work. Well, if that's the case, the second kind of addition we're making to our prayer life is one that we hope will serve everyone. And that is that over the next term, we're going to have a prayer list. And Becca will just kind of whip through these as I talk about this. But this is just a list of prayer points for every area of church life. And we hope that this will be a way for all of us to be involved in the prayer life of the church, whatever our commitments are. So some of them are specific. Some of them are fairly general points. But the reason we're putting this prayer list together, I guess, there's three reasons. Firstly, because we believe God answers prayer, and we are dependent on Him for everything we do, so we want to bring everything we do to Him. But secondly, it's because we want to enable all of us to be involved in prayer, even if we can't make a Sunday meeting. But then thirdly, and this is where we'll finish this morning, the reason we're doing this is because when we pray, it reminds us that we're reliant on God. When you ask someone for something, it puts you in a place of reliance. And as a church, it can be very easy to kind of roll out all these things we're doing, all these plans we have, and a bit like the church in Ephesus, forget that we are reliant on God for everything. Even though Jesus said to us, without me, you can do nothing. And so our hope through kind of investing in our prayer life as a church is not just that we'll kind of get prayers answered, although, of course, we hope that's the case, but it's that it will draw us close to God, so that as we go and serve Him, we will do that connected to the source of the love that we're called to share. And this is where I kind of want to lead us to respond this morning, is by, just as a church, drawing close to Him. And the way we're going to do this is by, as the band come up and join me, by breaking bread together. So if you were here last week, you'll remember there are a number of words about the church in Revelation 3, Laodicea. And in that passage, Jesus says to the church, whoever opens the door, I will come and eat with him and he with me. It's an invitation to a church that's turned away from God to come and welcome Him back in and enjoy His presence. And so as we begin this year, I want us to break bread together as a way to remind ourselves both of what Jesus has done for us that we were singing about earlier, but also as a whole church to say, Jesus, we are dependent on you for this year. We're dependent on your blood to cleanse us. We're dependent on you to nourish us for everything we're going to do. So can I ask us to stand? And then I'm going to pray. And then if you're a believer in Jesus, as the band lead us, let's just come and take the bread and the grape juice together to remember what Jesus had done for us. So let me pray. Jesus, we thank you so much that you are the good shepherd who gave his life for the sheep, and that we as a church are here this morning as your people because you have died for us and you have called each one of us into your presence. And as we come and break bread together, we pray that you would just remind us again of your goodness, your grace to us. And would you then send us out as your church to do all that you are calling us to do this year? Amen. Let's break bread together now.